Hello, glad you could join me. Today I'm going to be carrying on with these tong making videos, and we're going to be making a pair of wolf jaw tongs. So wolf jaw tongs are a little bit like a pair of flat bit tongs in the way that they look. However, they're more like a pair of bolt jaw tongs in the way that we use them, as they actually hold round or square stock in the jaws. And so we do this by using a bit of bar that we want the tongs to hold, putting that into our tongs, and then hammering, whilst the tongs are hot, hammering on the jaws, to create an indent in the tongs to fit the bit of bar. I hope that makes sense. Let's get into the video and I can show you the processes that I go through when making this pair of tongs. I just want to start by talking about this pair of tongs, which is a pair of scrolling tongs that I made recently in another video. And I've realized, because I've been using these for like the past week or so, and they're just not quite comfortable in the hand. And after looking at them, I've realized that you can make left-handed and right-handed pairs of tongs. So this pair is a left-handed pair of tongs, because that's sort of what I always make. I always make left-handed pairs of tongs because I'm right-handed, and so I'm holding the stock in my left hand and hammer in my right. But scrolling tongs I use in my right hand because I'm holding the stock in my left hand and then using the tongs to bend it to the shape that I want it to be. And so this was how I realized that this pair is actually a left-handed pair, is it doesn't fit right, it's not comfortable in my hand, and that's because of the way that the reins form. You can see that this rein here, as it's in my hand, this one is on top and this one is below, whereas in my left hand, that one is below, this one is on top. So that's more comfortable compared with that. Really, it's only noticeable on a small pair of tongs where the reins don't get chance to come into parallel. You can see by the end they are parallel, but because it's such a small pair, you can really feel it in your hand, whereas in this hand it's nice and comfortable and is the right way around. So this is the pair of tong that we're going to make today, which is a wolf jaw tong, and so I'll show how we make a left-handed and right-handed pair using this blank. So you see that we have the offset there, where we've come over the far edge, and so we've done that here. We were parallel, we've turned to clockwise with the jaw sticking out away from the anvil, and then come and made our offset there. So to make a right-handed pair of tongs, which is what we should have done with these, we should have come here, turned clockwise, the jaw facing us, and then offset that material. And that means that the reins here would then have been the correct way round for a right-handed pair of tongs. It's just something that I've never even thought about when making tongs, because I've always made them for my left hand, and so I've always just gone the same way every time. And I thought, you know, it never really mattered whether the jaw was facing towards me or away from me. So, it's, you know, I've learnt something from making this pair of tongs, which is very interesting. As I said, today we are going to be making a pair of wolf jaw tongs. This is one half of the pair, and you can see that at the moment it just looks like a flat bit set of tongs. However, what we're going to do is, once I've made the other pair, which is what you're going to see, because they're exactly the same in making this one to the one that we're going to be making in a minute. Once we've got those two made and riveted together, we'll then put a little bit of round bar into the jaws so that we can actually set the jaws to fit a specific size stock. And it means that you can use them as flat bit tongs if you want to, but also use them to hold. I'm going to make this for a 6mm round bar. So I've got a piece of 16mm square bar, which is what we're going to use to forge it. That's heating up in the fire, so we can get to taking our first heat on this pair of tongs. I made a mark at 1 inch from the edge of the anvil, and so this is where we're going to lay off some material for the jaw, and then we'll come on the 45 with the jaw sticking out, so we make sure to make a left-handed pair of tongs and isolate that material again and forge it down thin for the boss. I'll take about a cube of material, a little bit over a cube, and set down the next isolation. This isolation, which we can forge out a lot more next heat, is going to be the back of the boss. So we've got a really rough preform of the tong there, so we've just got to refine it all and then draw out the reins. Got a nice high heat, and we can come and smoosh the material for the boss, so we can gain a bit of width and reduce the length. This is the half that I've already forged out, and you can see that at the end of the tong there's just a bit of a taper, a steep taper on the end. So to do that, smaller anvil with this anvil block, which is really useful, is we can then forge tapers like this without running the risk of dinging our anvil face, which we would do if we were doing that. Whereas on here you can see that we've got enough clearance just about over the far edge, so we're not dinging the anvil, the block there. And it's so that we don't mess up the inside shoulder if we were to try and do it, you know, on the flat of the anvil there. It's just a useful tool to make sure that we can easily put a taper on the end of a piece which has a sort of isolation limiting how far we can put it on the face of the anvil. We've got this half of the tongs forged out. I want to mention something now which I did talk about in the previous video on making a pair of scrolling tongs, which is about the thickness along the reins of the tong. So we've got to make sure that the boss, which is this section here, is the thickest section from here back along the reins. As if this section, sort of the start of the reins, is thicker, then when we're using the tongs, they can sort of overlap along where the reins are, just behind the boss, if the boss is thinner than the reins, and therefore they sort of get stuck open and you can't actually close the tongs. And also it'll just mean that they run smoother because we have that clearance there between where the boss is and the reins start. You can see on this one that this is the thickest section of the reins. What I'm going to do is set this area with the hammer, so we've got the taper beginning to forge out on the reins, and then we'll cut it off from this bar, or even leave it on this bar, and get a sledgehammer out so that we can quickly draw this material down. If you don't have a sledgehammer, you can just come over the far edge, half on, half off, and draw it out. It does take a bit of time. You can, of course, weld reins on. I personally wouldn't weld your tong reins on, just because if there is a weld in there, you do run the risk of the weld being a potential flaw and cracking, and then you're having your rein snap off, which you never want to do when you're using a pair of tongs. So I'll just draw it out with a sledgehammer, and even with a hand hammer, once you've gone through all the preparation of setting a scarf weld, it's probably going to be about the same amount of time as if you can just quickly and effectively draw it out over the far edge. So I'll get this set, and then we can have some fun with the sledgehammer. we've got our proportions correct on this end of the bar. The next thing to do is to get our sledgehammers and draw this material out. So I'll come in and neaten it all with a hand hammer now, so we can get all of this taper nice down to a neat square, then octagon, then round, then knock down these sides, making it a nice oval. So I want to talk about the reins and the shape that I put on the reins. So as I said before, I do an oval on this section, and that's because an oval is going to be the strongest shape that we can make, as well as being a really comfortable shape in the hand. So if we look at this one, which is the half that I made a little while ago, or the first half that I made, you can see for about the first 5 inches or 4 inches, it's still very much a square shape to the reins, and that's because that's going to be the strongest shape that we can make. And if the reins were going to bend, they bend in this first section. So by leaving more volume in there with the square means that they're not going to bend, and we don't need this first 4-inch section to be oval and have nice rounded edge and nice and comfortable, as you're never going to be holding a tong up there. So we can leave that nice and square and gradually fade it into an oval. And we do an oval as we still have a nice long side on this side of the plane, if you understand what I mean, because we're going to be pressuring the tongs, holding the tongs there. And so it's going to be really a strong shape in this direction, so it's not going to bend when we force that grip on to hold something in the jaws. I've got the rein that we're working on at the moment clamped in the vise, and I'm just going to take a rasp. It's still a bit warm, so I'm going to take a rasp and smooth down all these edges. So you can see when we then hammer on this plane to form the oval from a round shape, we end up with these sharp sort of corners on the sides. And so that can be really annoying when it's in your hand and you can get blisters and all sorts of stuff. So we're just going to take that off quickly with a rasp so it's much more comfortable in the hand. If you have the reins at quite a high heat, you end up just bending them when you're going on with the rasp. So I do it at a bit much lower heat. It's, you know, it's a black heat. It's still really hot. I don't want to touch it, but it's not so hot that when I'm rasping, it's going to bend. The last thing to do before we drill the holes and put it all together is just put a slight bend in the first, maybe 4 inches, the square section of the reins. So this is the pair of bolt jaw tongs that I made recently, and you can see that this top half of the tongs is bent slightly towards me just here, and that's so that the reins come in parallel down here where your hand's going to be, rather than sticking out at this sort of triangular shape. They come in parallel to each other, so it's much more comfortable in the hand, and it's literally just this slight bend in the first 4 inches of the reins. And that'll do it. It is hardly anything, the bend. It's very, very slight. So I've got an 8.5mm hole drilled in both of our reins, and that's so we have a little bit of clearance on the 8mm rod, which is what we're going to use to rivet these two together. I've got that heating up in the fire. We can bring that out, slide it into the hole, get it set with a couple of blows on this side, flip it over, tap through some material, so we then have an even amount of material on both sides, so we get even rivet heads forming. We can then properly set it and get that rivet over nice and upset into the nice round head that we want on both sides. I've also countersunk the holes just to deburr them, just really slightly, and that means that the tongs will work a bit smoother when they're pivoting. So we can use the ball peen to create a nice round head on the rivets. Just carefully. Obviously, all that we have at the moment is a pair of flat bit tongs. You can see we do need to align the jaws and address those, but we've got to do this in the next step, as we are going to make a pair of wolf jaw tongs. And so to do that, I want them to fit 6mm round. I'll slide this in there and then hammer the jaws together, which will then put the shape of our 6mm round into the jaws. So when we come to hold a piece of 6mm round, we can just slide it in there. I'll also do a horizontal sort of divot in there, so we can hold the bar this way when we're upsetting, if we ever want to upset some 6mm bar, which I don't think I've ever done, but it will be handy for the tongs to do that on that one occasion when we do. I also want to try something new with this pair of wolf jaw tongs, which I don't think I've ever seen anybody else do, which is put a diagonal on there. And so that is so that I can hold something like this, so it's still relatively easy to get it parallel to the anvil face, whilst having something on the end of the bar back here. So say an animal head or a little scroll or something, whatever it is, on the end of the bar that we're working on. I can then have that hanging outside the back end of the tongs, whereas if it was here, and in parallel with the tongs, it would just be sitting and butting up against the back there, and we couldn't actually close the tongs. So by having it on the diagonal, hopefully this is going to be a more versatile tool with much more applications, which I think that's the only downside to a pair of wolf jaw tongs, or a standard pair, is that you can't hold something where you have something on the end of the bar that you're going to forge. So let's get these back in the fire and do a bit of tapping around and forging with this bar in there to create our divots. So, in hindsight, I think that it would have been better to forge the divots in the jaws of the tongs whilst we had the two halves separated, rather than doing it when they're riveted together. I think it was a little bit more of a faff to try and get those lines centered and even as we were forging on the jaws. So I think it would have been much better if I had done those fullers before putting the pair of tongs together. So I've never even made a pair of flat bit tongs before, so I was really pleased actually with how this pair of tongs has turned out, considering it's my first sort of go at making a pair of tongs in this style. However, this is not the best pair of tongs that I've ever made. There are many areas of improvement on this pair of tongs. So it's certain things which I think I could have done better, as I said before, with the fuller marks. They're not quite even and they're not quite in the right places. And also I think when you do put the fuller marks in, don't go back and change the shape of the jaw, if you understand what I mean. Because when we put the fuller marks in, the material is going to spread. And so I went back and cleaned up the profile again with a hammer. However, that then distorts the shape that we just then put in the jaw. So I think the best thing to do with these is to fuller the lines in when we have the two halves separated, and then just leave them. Don't even go back and clean the profile. So we are going to get a slight bit of sort of movement or swelling on the jaws, but I think that's fine. You can live with it, and you can call it an aesthetic item on the piece. So thank you for watching the video. I've got a couple more ideas of pairs of tongs that I want to make, so there'll be one or two more videos, so stick around if you want to see those.